So yeah, Dan, if you had to choose between a job or life, which would you pick and why?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Eddie Izzard has this great routine about if you're being imprisoned by the British Empire, you have to choose between tea and cake or death. That's how that would work.
A lot of people choose death.
Well, or they run out of tea and cake. That's part of his point. And you don't have a choice anymore. Okay, we've gotten off to kind of an odd start this morning.
Yeah, the people are in a pandemic. They don't have any better way to spend their time. But we're talking about jobs versus lives. This somehow in our political discourse, we're presented with these as competing options. Like you have to prioritize one or the other.
Yeah, this has become increasingly a major narrative. Mm-hmm. For those of you that don't know us yet, aren't part of our massive fan base, I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing.
And I'm Mark Van Steenwyk from the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
Yeah. Yes. So this has sadly become this great binary, and I feel like, unfortunately, many people have bought into this as a way of arguing about what's going on right now. So this episode, in some ways, is a little bit of a continuation from the discussion about the protests, because a lot of the protests are being framed in this way. And we wanted to explore this because, unfortunately, to me, ending up trapped in this binary is a huge mistake. It's a mistake on many levels. I mean, it's a mistake from a socio-political level. It's a mistake from a spiritual and compassion level. It's also a mistake from a political strategy level. And unfortunately, over the last number of years, the non-Trumpian party seems to have picked up some kind of very bad strategy, maybe virus. They've got their own virus. It's the bad strategy virus. And and telling people that their work and their livelihood is bad and irrelevant just seems like a real losing political strategy.
Yes, and I think there's some assumptions underneath this that I think are worth interrogating. Like, and I was just talking about this before. Like, somehow it's assumed that if you don't work, then you will just end up destitute, and that's like just cause and effect. Like, there's no alternative. It's like these conversations I've heard around automation. We have robots replacing us. Somehow we think if you don't have a job, I guess you end up homeless, even though overall productivity has gone up. So that somehow we've delinked in our brain any sort of the idea of there being a commonwealth or a common inheritance or common prosperity. It's you have to exchange your life for work in order to live. And if you can't, then you're going to die anyways. So why either we die by not having jobs, or let some of these old people die now.
Right.
That's kind of what's assumed somehow in this.
Yeah, and one, to me, the classic example that lifts up exactly what you're talking about is what is going on right now in the food industry, right? So you have all of this food literally being destroyed, thrown away, dumped, animals killed, eggs squashed. I mean, just craziness. And then you also have a whole group of people in our society that are thinking, I'm not going to have a job, I can't eat. Right? And so those two things occurring at the same time is exactly a manifestation of what you're talking about. That our economy and our society, the way jobs function, have so little to do with taking care of our people. We've already got some great comments going on here.
Colette writes, I put a post on Hip Nashville and had so many people attacking me. I was asking people to sign up to help those who cannot pay their rents or mortgages. It's very sad. I have so many friends working in India. People say they may die of starvation before they need help. I think many people need to think more globally. I mean, both those show the same kind of thinking.
Right.
It's just bizarre to me that people get angry at the idea of like, hey, if you don't need that money, maybe give it to somebody else.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, this is where we're seeing like crisis can bring out the best in people, but it also brings out the worst. And so right now there's an ingrained set of assumptions in our society that you get what you deserve. Like it's a meritocracy. Mm-hmm. And right now a meritocracy, even if it existed, can't function. Mm-hmm. So people are doubling down on meritorious thinking, like that somehow I worked hard for this government check. I'm not going to share it with someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, and then again, when you have this highly disconnected sort of social setup, it precludes you from thinking creatively, right? So, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, where they're doing a remarkable job dealing with this, one of the things that they have done is that they have recruited people who have become unemployed by some of the social distancing measures, and they're actually using them in the work that they're doing against the virus. So they're recruiting them to help with testing. They're recruiting them to help with distribution of food and medical materials. They're recruiting them to help other people, get out the word about how they're dealing with this, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, they're saying, okay, great. Right now you can't do the job that you're doing. There's plenty of work to do. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. Whereas here, there's this, very weird idea that if you're, unemployed, you're somehow useless to society. Mm-hmm. And right, you're just going to starve to death, which just seems completely bizarre.
And one of the things that's come up, so I've posted some stuff on Facebook kind of challenging the dominant capitalist stuff. I mean, that's pretty much my shtick, is just dumping on capitalism, and then what energy I have left I dump on Jordan Peterson. But someone pointed out, like, I'm sympathetic towards these people who want to go back to work, because what else are they going to do? And there's this assumption as I was having this conversation with this person that, ideally we should have something like socialism, but we're in a pandemic. We're stuck with this crappy system, so we just have to make it work the best we can. We don't have the luxury of an alternative, which is always the line that comes out, right? Mm-hmm. That we don't have luxury to actually try to get the economy to work for us. We don't have the luxury, as though a crisis isn't the perfect time to say, this isn't working, let's do something different, please. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why do we have to choose death, some form of death, before we are willing to say, maybe we should figure out a way to extract wealth from where it's pooled, like in the coffers of the rich or whatever, and redistribute some of that? Or mm-hmm. maybe we have to think of a jobs program, like the way you're talking about. It sounds like some sort of almost like a FDR-like jobs program, right, for American health. Some ways of reorienting and reframing this, because obviously my productivity paying for my life, and if I'm not productive, I don't deserve to live. That logic isn't working.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And a shout out to folks who've checked in. Hey, Rex, mm-hmm. Kathleen said hi, and now she's got a good comment. So
a couple comments here.
There. Yeah, a couple.
Kathleen writes, most people hate the parable Jesus taught where everyone got the same pay no matter how long they worked. It was not an economic parable, of course, but it hits a raw nerve for people enjoying privilege.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I've just watched people tie themselves up in knots and go crazy. That parable, and it's the perfect parable for the capitalist meritocracy worldview. Mm-hmm. Protestant work ethic worldview. There's nothing worse than the idea that I got paid when I didn't work hard, and it drives people crazy.
Well, and it's weird, it gets twisted. So then this is where we end up thinking somehow Jeff Bezos worked for those 50 billion or whatever he has now.
Oh, he's closing in on 200 billion.
I don't even know. Like, I can't even fathom
think.
more than a million. So this is all
Right.
like, okay, so he has a gazillion trillion.
Right.
But like that, we have this assumption that somehow, if they have it, they must have earned it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the logic too. So the
Yeah.
idea that we even think about taxing them, which is just the least thing we could think about doing, is somehow theft. That's more egregious than letting this person die of starvation. Like, our
Right.
morality is twisted, and Zarius writes, collectivized resentment, which we're talking about here, is hard to challenge when a sizable amount of people would rather self-harm, die, or bring, quote, the end times, unquote, than live in a loving world where the other can heal
Yeah.
and thrive.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that actually gets at another thing that we were talking about here that I think very much connects to all of this is that, in the Western medical system, we do not have a definition of health.
Mhm.
I mean, this may sound very odd, particularly when we're in the midst of this, but it's actually true. And, some people have tried to do this, some public health people and different things here or there, but they are incredibly minority voices. I mean, if you go to medical school or you get educated as a nurse practitioner or, all these various medical professions, this is even true in Western psychology. There really is no positive definition of health, right? Health is basically assumed to just be the absence of illness.
Mhm.
Now, this is actually different from other medical systems. I mean, traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, certainly indigenous healing practices, they actually have a very clear and simple positive definition of health that's defined based on their system and how they understand the human being. And so if your only definition of health is an absence of illness, right? And we're seeing this playing out with this pandemic thing. It's just don't get the virus, right? That's the only kind of message and definition of a good outcome that we're talking about. And so all of these other arenas of health, right? Our mental health, our social health, our economic health. I mean, all of these things that actually are really important for healthy lives, the health of other people, right? So, both Colette and Zarius are talking about that, right? It actually benefits everyone for other people to be healthy. None of these things really reflexively come into play, and so it's very hard then to come up with holistic policies when you don't even understand or have a reference point for what the positive goal is.
Mhm. This is coming from Colette. I don't want to talk about worldview if we are just talking about Western world. Is this conversation pertaining to Western society?
Yeah, Colette, I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at there, but I mean, worldview, when we've been talking about that, we've been talking a lot about the fact that each individual person and then social groups develop a worldview. But no, not necessarily. This conversation is just pertaining to Western society.
I mean, we're talking about the problems we're having in this society and then in previous ones, we've talked about how different cultures and societies have been dealing with this pandemic differently and how largely we can learn from that. And so this is a problem of worldview. If, like, especially the capitalist worldview, like, where we somehow just can't even fathom, like, the idea of property rights as an individual right that is sacred, even more sacred than another person's life. So much that you can kill someone if they try to take anything from you. Like, there's all these sorts of assumptions baked into this American, Western, white American perspective that needs to be confronted, especially in this time, because we're now seeing how much it doesn't work.
Yep.
And we're still in the beginning of this. Like, things can get so much worse. Like, this is just and I'm not trying to diminish how frustrating this has been and painful, and it's caused people's lives and well-being. That's very true. But things could continue to dissolve and get worse unless we reframe this and start working from a different way of looking at the situation, so that it's not just, well, if we have half of LA is unemployed, I guess it's given enough time, if we run out of money, half of LA gets to die.
Right.
That's where it's headed, unless we think about it differently.
Yeah. And so again, I think that and to me, this is where the spiritual life comes into all of this, right? Because the spiritual life has always actually tried to cultivate a direction towards health and wholeness. So yes, it does talk about what the problem is, and again, whether that's the ego or fallen human being, or, all of the different ways that different spiritual traditions have talked about this. But the spiritual life also sets out a good result. Like, what is the thing that we're moving towards? And of course, in the Christian tradition, this is often talked about as the kingdom of God. Buddhist tradition, they talk about enlightenment. But there really is an understanding of what the good endpoint is, which is really important, because if all we have is what we're trying to avoid and run from, then the question becomes, well, where are we running to? Okay, so I'm running away from this virus, but what am I trying to get to? And I think a lot of the chaos of these dualities has to do with the fact that we don't actually have a very positive definition of what we're trying to get to, other than maybe making money.
No, this is where even it's infected our religious categories. So the kingdom of God, growing up, was like, oh, that's when you don't go to hell.
Right.
So you avoid hell. Or it's the absence of sin.
Right.
Like, it's not, the biblical vision of the kingdom of God is positive. It's like, even if you look at the image in Revelation, it's a giant cube city where it's always bright and no one ever gets sick or dies, and everybody gets to bask in the glorious light of the Lamb. It's like this. I don't know if I like that image as much as maybe some other ones, but it's a positive image.
Right.
So yeah, even like this, here's a comment from Kathleen. I've read that there were short times in Europe during the Middle Ages when no one owned property and the whole community shared the land and its resources. I think it's complex, but yeah, there was a lot of land was just part of the commons.
Right.
So even if we think about feudalism being bad, there was still like this sense of obligation that people could access the land if they needed it. So this is where you get the Robin Hood story later on, when they enclosed the lands, and all of a sudden, if you killed one of the king's deer, you could die as an outlaw. That was before that. Before that happened, they could just go hunt deer if you wanted, because it was commons.
Right. Yeah, and so again, from the land would be a fascinating sort of example for all of this, right? I mean, we are seeing how our industrialized food system, which is also part of this whole situation, right? Why are there 20 million fewer farmers than there were 3 or 4 decades ago? Well, because you couldn't make money farming. So they've, gone bankrupt, consolidated. You have these massive places. And now, a bunch of people get COVID at some plant in South Dakota, and suddenly everybody's like, oh my God, we're not going to have any bacon. And these hog farmers are like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to kill. I mean, we were listening to this woman on the radio the other day. I mean, they're talking about having to euthanize 400,000 pigs in Minnesota and Iowa over the next couple of months if they can't get these plants back up and running again. I mean, it's just completely insane. But that's when you have this economy that has all gravitated around this particular monetary idea of health, that's what you create. So we'll have people starving, and we'll have people throwing pigs in mass graves.
Maybe you could say more about this series, but Aries writes, I think this is where we can learn something from the virtue ethics thought regarding knowing where to run to. The way I'm interpreting what you're saying is like virtue ethics being that you cultivate positive virtue in your life. These are things that you're not only aspiring to, but you build up so that it's just the way you go. And that's an interesting thing, because we don't, our society doesn't really think in terms of what is a virtuous life as much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
As a positive, it's avoidance of bad things and then
Yeah.
having a job.
Well, or again, if we think about virtue ethics, it's highly individualized, right? And we've
Yes.
talked a lot about this. Like, I am a good person, and that's it, right? And my goodness has nothing to do with the whole, right? The polis, the city, and that's of course one of the major images in the Bible, throughout the Bible, is the kingdom. And again, we're not into kingdoms per se. But it is this notion of the whole people. And if the whole people is not doing well, it doesn't really matter if one person is super virtuous,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that it's that virtue ethics, but applied on a system-wide level.
Mm-hmm.
And that is often almost totally absent in our society. Or again, it becomes very tribal. Right, like my church, my group of people, we're virtuous. Everybody else is toast, and we discussed that a couple days ago.
Yeah. So, I mean, what do we do from here? Is like kind of the question. So we're kind of we're stuck as a society with some. I mean, I feel like Minnesota is one of the better states in responding to this because, and I don't know why. But there has always been a tendency to, like even we had rural Minnesota was socialistic until the 30s. So it was like, it's still part of the, as flawed as Minnesota culture is, white Minnesota culture is, there's still some of that Scandinavian communalism that's
Right.
built into the
Right.
fabric of white society in Minnesota. And so then when you have a governor saying like, heck, I don't care if I'm risking our budget, we're going to like try to outpace every other state in having testing and do these things. Still not enough, but
Mm-hmm.
it's something. But I couldn't.
Well, I mean, to me, I think one of the things that's really important is for us to recognize the temptation to fall into these dualities and to not do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, that's sort of the starting point, is the awareness. I mean, the number of people that I have seen that have just reflexively over the last week fallen right into this is very sad. I mean, it's very, and I think extremely unhelpful, right? And so I think part of it is just personally to recognize when that's happening and developing that awareness and saying, no, I'm not going to do that, right? And I'm going to try to think about, work for, develop, right, another way.
Yeah. So the example of this duality be someone saying, those stupid protesters, they want to go back to work because they're selfish and they want to put all of our lives in jeopardy.
Right.
As though in our system, you're asking them to choose their death or somebody else's death.
Mm-hmm.
That's the question. And so and it makes sense that you'd protect you and yours. Like that's also a very American thing of self-defense. So what else are they going to do? There's no guarantee that they're going to be okay. Who's going to guarantee that? They can't trust our leadership. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense from a certain logic that they'd be like, well, I'm just going to go back to work and now we need to end this.
Yeah. Yeah. So to me, that's always a starting point, is to not go into a certain rabbit hole, right? I mean, often we talk about the fact that you can't get to good answers unless you're asking the right questions, right? And so if the question is immediately, well, are you in favor of jobs or getting the virus? That's a question that you're never going to find a good answer from that perspective. So I feel like that's the starting point, is to say, okay, so what questions are we going to start asking? And how are we going to start saying, well, no, we're in this conundrum because of all the issues that we've talked about here, a system that doesn't work for us. So let's start asking the question, well, how could we have a society where we could have no virus and jobs?
Yeah. How can we have an economy that works for everybody? Or how can we have a society where it's not assumed that some have to be sacrificed for others?
Right.
How do we do that? Can we do that? Well, the answer is yes, we can. Mm-hmm. we actually can. It's not an impossibility.
Mm-hmm.
But we act like it's an impossibility because there's certain assumptions that we need to interrogate and get them out of the way.
Yeah. Let's see.
Right, here's another comment from Colette. I think that is the key, is to not just talk, but to work to make change, even if it is small. Yeah.
Right.
Things now change in small moves, but moving is the start. We could start by ensuring communities that are not able to get healthy food have better access. So yes, we need to mobilize. Well, even these things you mentioned earlier, Colette, this how you try to, I think you mentioned like you try to post saying, hey, let's redistribute some of these checks. I've seen people doing that at different levels locally. I have friends like within a block of us who are like, they gave a lot of their check to some friends they knew who were struggling, and these people weren't well off themselves. So there is sharing what we have is a great start. And then also pressuring our local governments on up to reorient towards a sharing mentality. And I think mobilizing, starting where we're at, makes all kinds of sense.
Yeah. And so, right. We are powerless on a giant global scale. But we actually have a lot of power in our individual lives, in the relationships that we have, in the communities that we have. And maybe even one way that we start is we realize, oh, wow, maybe I don't have a lot of communal relationships. Maybe I don't have relationships with my local elected officials. Maybe I don't know anybody in my health department. And even that awareness is a positive thing, because then we can say, okay, well, so maybe my starting point is actually just starting to cultivate some of these relationships. If I am part of a faith community, is my faith community starting to contact people and engage in some of these conversations? So I think that seed of awareness, and again, this is the basic spiritual life teaching, right? That a seed of awareness is incredibly powerful. It may not seem like much, but it really can start to grow and move us in all sorts of new directions. And these things are, it's really, really important. Spring is coming. One of the fascinating things in a lot of cities is that they've told people that they can't grow gardens on their property. That would be a great thing to start to protest. It would be awesome if every single house in some suburb, tilled up a section of their lawn and started planting vegetables this year. If some city official came around and said you can't do it, the people on the block said, fine, sue us. We'll take you to court over this, because we're in a pandemic and we're isolated. We want to grow our own food. So there are all kinds of interesting and creative things that could probably start to happen.
Yeah, and I think adding pressure to the different, I'm an anarchist, so it's not like I trust the government, but I do think we can pressure. Like right now, like there's a lot of people in power do not like looking like they're a big idiot. And so they want to be able to do their job in a way that makes people happy so that they stay in power. So that's the obvious reason why an electoral system can sometimes be beneficial, is because then you can hold that over them. Like they're not installed as kings. So they want to do a good job, and they need to be pressured into thinking no longer just on the bottom line like they have in the past, like placating the rich. Like a bunch of dead people in their precinct is a bad thing. Right? So we can use that. I mean, I'm making it very plain, but like I think people are now more and more realizing that what we had in place was not sufficient, and they're having to figure stuff out now. And now's the time when you can speak into that and like direct what shape it takes as we start planning for what comes now and next.
Yeah, and I think honestly, educating ourselves as much about what other countries are doing in response to this, and we had the episode on American exceptionalism, right? And so there's this very powerful strain in our society, and honestly, we see this every single day from our leaders. This sense that we are the best at everything. And if we look around the world, honestly, we're barely in the top 10. I mean, we may be in 50th or something as far as how we're dealing with this. And so, so again, we get creative ideas from learning from others, and so, read about what they're doing in Iceland and South Korea and Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden. I mean, there's some really creative work being done around this. And interestingly, all of it is not just about the virus, right? Mm-hmm. It's also about how is society organized, right? How are we doing things together? Can we transcend politics, right? I mean, Australia is a great example. I mean, just a couple months ago, there were a lot of people, criticizing their leader as being sort of this right-wing nut. And he is completely transformed by this. And he has given over control over this to the Scientific Commission. He's actually created this national scientific working group that is meeting every single day, getting the best data together, feeding ideas to his government. He's completely let go of all of his hyper-partisan stuff. Australia and New Zealand are working together, and they have totally different politically oriented governments. So I think that's the other thing, is that if we're open to learning from others, we start to develop our own creativity and our creative ideas, which again, we're not going to be able to implement on a national scale, but it may help us implement on various local scales.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're past our time.
Yep.
And it's the weekend's coming up, so we'll be back on Monday.
Yeah.
We're not sure yet what we'll talk about on Monday, but on Tuesday we're having a guest, Gareth Higgins, who storyteller, writer, has done work as a film critic, activist, great guy, Irish. So I like listening to his voice better than listening to American voices because accents are somehow better. But he's also very wise, and he's going to talk about the stories that we tell ourselves during times like this, which we've touched on a little bit, but I think Gareth will bring a rich perspective with that.
Yeah, so that'd be great.
And in the meantime, if you have topics you'd like us to talk about that we haven't scratched the itch for you, just let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. You can post it on the transmission page, the Center for Prophetic Imagination page, the Micah page, either of us personally. You can message us. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you about what you'd like all of us to engage together. So great to see all of you. Thank you. Thanks as always for the great comments, and stay safe.
Yeah, we'll see you Monday.